The year was 1941, and I stood at the crossroads of my destiny, facing a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of my life and, unknowingly, the future of South Africa itself. Principal Kerr's words echoed through the corridors of Fort Hare University like a death knell: accept the student council position or leave this institution forever. Little did I know that this moment of defiance would become the catalyst for my transformation from a privileged tribal prince into the voice of millions of oppressed souls crying out for justice and equality. My name is Nelson Mandela, and this is the story of how a young man's refusal to compromise his principles led him from the hallowed halls of academia into the unforgiving streets of Johannesburg, where the harsh realities of apartheid would forge the leader I was destined to become. The path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, poverty, and struggle, but it was also paved with the unshakable conviction that no man should bow to injustice, regardless of the personal cost. When I first arrived at Fort Hare University in 1939, I carried with me the weight of expectation and the privilege of my royal heritage. Founded in 1916, Fort Hare stood as a beacon of hope for black intellectuals across South Africa, the first institution of higher learning to open its doors to students of color. The professors would remind us constantly, "Now that you are at Fort Hare, you will become leaders of your people." These words resonated deeply within me, though at the time I could not foresee how prophetic they would prove to be. The university was small and intimate, housing merely 150 students when I enrolled, all under the watchful eye of Scottish Principal Alexander Kerr. Despite its mission to prepare future tribal chiefs for their predetermined roles within the colonial system, Fort Hare inadvertently became something far more revolutionary, a breeding ground for the very leaders who would challenge and ultimately dismantle the oppressive structures it was meant to reinforce. The irony was not lost on me, even then, that an institution designed to maintain the status quo would produce some of the most formidable opponents of racial segregation. King Jongintaba, my guardian and regent, had ensured I was properly equipped for this momentous journey, commissioning my first suit, a symbol of the transformation from tribal prince to university scholar. Within those walls, I encountered minds that would later join me in the struggle for liberation, including Oliver Tambo, who would become not only my closest friend but also my partner in establishing South Africa's first black law firm. It was at Fort Hare that I first tasted Western classical culture, even performing as John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln's assassin, in a university production, an experience that would later take on profound symbolic meaning as I grappled with questions of violence, justice, and moral compromise. During my second year, the simmering discontent among students over the deplorable quality of our meals reached a boiling point, and I found myself at the center of a protest that would define my character for decades to come. We organized a boycott of the student council elections, a principled stand against the administration's indifference to our legitimate grievances. However, when some students broke ranks and participated in the voting, I discovered to my surprise that I had been elected to the very position I had encouraged others to reject. Principal Kerr's ultimatum was delivered with cold precision: accept the position and legitimize a corrupted process, or pack my belongings and leave Fort Hare forever. The weight of this decision pressed down upon me like a physical force, threatening to crush not only my academic aspirations but also the expectations of those who had invested their hopes and resources in my education. I sought counsel from my nephew K.D. Matenzima, whose experience and wisdom I respected, and his advice was unequivocal: do not compromise your principles, regardless of the consequences. Standing in that office, facing Principal Kerr's stern countenance, I made the choice that would echo through history. I would not be complicit in a system that demanded my silence in exchange for privilege. With my cousin Justice by my side, I walked away from the security and prestige of Fort Hare, carrying nothing but my convictions and the courage to face an uncertain future. The young man who entered that office emerged as someone fundamentally different, no longer content to accept the comfortable path of least resistance, but committed to a life of principled opposition to injustice. Returning to Maqhekazweni, I faced King Jongintaba's fury and disappointment, emotions that cut deeper than any physical punishment could have. In accordance with traditional customs, he arranged marriages for both Justice and myself, expecting us to settle into the predetermined roles of tribal nobility. However, the education he had so generously provided had awakened within us aspirations that transcended the boundaries of traditional expectations. We dreamed not of arranged marriages but of romantic love, of choices made freely rather than dictated by custom and convenience. Under the cover of darkness, Justice and I fled to Johannesburg, abandoning security and status for the promise of self-determination. I carried with me only that single suit, now showing 5 years of wear and more patches than original fabric, a tangible reminder of how far I had traveled from my privileged beginnings. The decision to flee was not motivated by the appearance of our intended brides. Indeed, by all accounts they were beautiful young women, but by our newfound understanding that true dignity lay in the freedom to shape our own destinies. Johannesburg greeted me with the cruel indifference of a city that measured worth in productivity rather than pedigree, and I quickly learned that my royal heritage meant nothing in the face of racial discrimination. I wandered from job to job, working briefly as a mine security guard before being dismissed sleeping wherever kind souls would offer shelter, often viewed by host families as nothing more than another mouth to feed with little to offer in return. The suburb of Alexandra, where I eventually found lodging, was a sprawling testament to the inequalities of apartheid, a place where magnificent structures stood alongside shanties, where hope and despair existed in uncomfortable proximity. During these difficult months, my survival often depended on the kindness of friends like Zachariah Malit, whose father owned a grocery store and whose Methodist faith compelled him to share his food with those less fortunate. It was in Alexandra that I truly began to understand the urban African experience, witnessing firsthand how the system of white supremacy had created a permanent underclass of talented, ambitious individuals, whose potential was systematically suppressed by racial legislation and economic discrimination. In 1941, destiny intervened in the form of Walter Sisulu, a man whose vision would prove instrumental in shaping my political awakening, and whose friendship would sustain me through the darkest periods of struggle ahead. When I walked into his office, neither of us could have predicted the significance of that encounter. Though Sisulu would later reflect, we wanted to be a mass movement. And then one day a mass leader walked into my office. His recognition of something within me that I had not yet fully discovered gave me the confidence to believe that my sacrifice at Fort Hare had not been in vain. Through Sisulu's intervention, I secured employment at the Jewish law firm of Witkin, Sadelsky and Eidelman, the only legal practice in the city willing to hire a black assistant. This opportunity allowed me to complete my Bachelor of Arts degree through correspondence with the University of South Africa in 1942. The same year, I began attending informal meetings of the African National Congress. The following year, I enrolled in law studies at the University of Witwatersrand, determined to master the very legal system that had been constructed to oppress my people. Working within the legal profession provided me with an intimate understanding of how justice was systematically denied to black South Africans, how laws were selectively applied based on race rather than merit or evidence. When Oliver Tambo and I later established the country's first black law firm, we witnessed daily the perversion of justice that characterized apartheid South Africa. Experiences that would inform every aspect of my later political activism and leadership. It was only in Johannesburg, stripped of my tribal privileges and reduced to just another poor black man from the countryside, that I truly comprehended the vast chasm separating white and black South Africans. This shocking realization ignited within me an unquenchable fire of resistance that would burn for decades to come. No longer could I ignore the systematic oppression that defined our society. And it was this awakening that drew me inexorably toward the African National Congress and the struggle for liberation. The journey from Fort Hare to Johannesburg had transformed me from a sheltered prince into a conscious revolutionary. And though I could not foresee the decades of imprisonment, sacrifice, and struggle that lay ahead, I knew with absolute certainty that I had found my purpose. The choice I made in Principal Kerr's office to reject compromise in favor of principle had set me on the path that would ultimately lead to freedom for all South Africans. Looking back on those formative years, I understand now that every hardship, every moment of doubt, every sacrifice was necessary preparation for the role I would play in dismantling apartheid and building a democratic South Africa. The young man who chose principle over privilege at Fort Hare University became the leader who would spend 27 years in prison rather than abandon his commitment to justice and equality. My story demonstrates that true leadership is born not from comfort and compliance, but from the courage to stand against injustice, even when the personal cost seems unbearable. The lessons learned in those early years of struggle in Johannesburg about resilience, about the power of unity, about the unbreakable human spirit, would guide me through the darkest hours of imprisonment and emerge as the foundation stones upon which we built our rainbow nation.